So lesson 2 for this module, we're going to talk about troubleshooting tools. We know that this is a very, very dynamic environment. Lots of things change in this environment with regard to the radio frequency spectrum. And a lot of these things can be managed through either Cisco Prime Infrastructure or through the Mobility Services Engine or Cisco MSE. These products are outside of the scope of this class. I mean, we've done some basic introductory stuff too with Cisco PI and MSE, but we do still want to take a look at potentially some of the tools that are going to be available for you. And we'll talk about those tools. We'll also talk about some third-party tools that are useful for troubleshooting as well. All right. And there are a whole bunch of different tools available. So we're not going to certainly talk about all of them. But when it comes to managing wireless, there's really only 2 things, essentially, assuming that everything has been configured and set up initially, 2 things that you generally have to troubleshoot: the spectrum or security, right? Whether it's authentication, authorization, and policy enforcement. Those are really the only 2 things that we have issues with usually in a wireless LAN environment. So within that realm, you have layer 1 issues, you have layer 2 issues, and you have layer 3 issues. Layer 1 is the spectrum. So you would, that's where all the RF energy sits, and you would need a spectrum analyzer to be able to identify issues in layer 1. You may not know what those RF devices are, but you can see radio frequency interference, and then you can kind of do some additional investigation to try and identify what the device is. Probably the easiest one to implement, given that you guys are running AirOS and you've got this centralized deployment model, the easiest one to implement would be the Clean Air technology, right? Deploy a couple of access points as SE Connect access points, use the Spectrum Expert software to do your spectrum analysis. But you can use Channelizer, that's by MetaGeek. Cisco Meraki has an RF spectrum analyzer in it, but there are many, many different spec-an tools out there. At layer 2, this is where we'd use a Wi-Fi scanner. Tools like SS Insider, that's spelled INSSIDER, obviously, SSID. That's a free application by MetaGeek. Wi-Fi Analyzer, Airport Utility by Apple, and there's some other utilities as well. But what we're looking for here are things like beacons, management frames, Wi-Fi, any kind of 802.11 encapsulated traffic. And then you can do packet analysis. Typically we use Wireshark, but you can use AirMagnet, Omnipeak, MetaGeek IPA, and so on. IPA is a play on IP, right? But IP analysis. But this is a traffic at the packet level. It could be between the AP and the clients, and so on. Tools, these tools are typically require specialized adapters. Those adapters are operating in promiscuous mode that allows us to analyze that traffic. Let's take a look at what a spectrum analyzer looks like and what kind of information I can gain from a spectrum analyzer. This is the MetaGeek Channelizer product. It's used with its own RF spectrum adapter. It's called WiSpy. Kind of expensive, but obviously in a large enterprise environment, that's relative to the cost of downtime and the cost of issues in the wireless network. You can also connect to a Cisco AP in Spectrum Expert mode as well to get this information. But you do need an additional license from MetaGeek to be able to support that functionality. So this is going to measure RF signals in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, the 5 gigahertz spectrum. We can detect things like co-channel interference, overlapping channels. We can see and identify non-Wi-Fi interferers in the RF space, and it is OS based. Okay. Cisco Clean Air is another option. We see that one here. Clean Air can be enabled on the controller or in converged access mode on WCM to scan the RF space automatically. It also has the ability to identify RF interferers, but it can also indicate which APs have reported that particular problem so that we can maybe identify the location of that interferer in the network. We can generate reports, we can look at severity levels, and so on. Cisco Meraki has its own RF spectrum analyzer as well. The Meraki APs have a dedicated radio just for analyzing the radio frequency spectrum. So you go into the Meraki dashboard, go to the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz spectrum, and you can analyze both of those. It does continuous monitoring in the background because we do have a separate radio for this analysis, which makes that Meraki product even better, right? Because it allows us to use that information to automatically optimize the network. We have Wi-Fi scanners that are available. Insider 4, I think they have a newer version now. This is the one that I tend to use. It's a third-party laptop wireless scanning tool. Basically allows you to identify what's being used in the wireless LAN. It works with the adapter built into your device, especially if your adapter is dual band. It can display things like SSIDs, MAC addresses, channels that you're using, and so on. Let me pull up the, I believe I have the application on my computer here, but data rates, it can run in Windows, run in Mac OS, and it's not free, but it can be quote unquote free depending on where you get it from, but it's relatively inexpensive and relatively easy to use. So here is the application on my computer here. Let me make sure I got it in my recording window. So you can see I'm seeing all kinds of different things in the network, the channels that are being used, the signal strength, the physical layer type, is it an NAP, is it an AC, the data rate, the maximum data rate, and so on. So we can, sort by SSID names. If we click the columns here, we can sort. So I can say, okay, what's the best signal that I see, right? And oops, sorry, and that would be the Belkin. And then this guy here is right next to me. These are probably my neighbors directly across the wall here. But anyway, you can see the amount of data that bandwidth that's supported. You can see how the channels are allocated. So here's my 2.4 gigahertz band, and we can see the RSSI. So this is channel 1, channel 6, channel 11. We can see that there is one access point here. Looks like it's kind of running on channel 8. And then here we can see the spectrum in the 5 gigahertz range. What's running in 36, 44, 52, and 60, and 149, 161, and so on. And these are the MAC addresses of the radios. So it's a kind of a cool tool, right? Gives you information. If you want to go do a survey and you want to do an active survey, you can use this tool to do that. So it's pretty cool. And you can get that from various locations. Android has an application as well. It's called Wi-Fi Analyzer. I'm sure there's a similar application in the Apple software as well. This is just an example of the Wi-Fi Analyzer on Android. Let me kill this application real quick. It's taking up all my bandwidth. Close all windows. Hold on one second. Kill this guy. All right. There are a bunch of tools available, and they all pretty much report on the same thing. You want to see how the channels are being used, and you want to see what the interference is. All right. So here's the Apple Airport utility, iOS 8.0 and above. Same thing. Gives you the channel, RSSI, the MAC address of the radio, and so on. As far as packet analyzers go, Wireshark works very well. This is MetaGeek IPA. Captures wireless packets using a specialized adapter. Remember, in wireless, you're typically only going to see, if you're using something like Wireshark, you're only going to see things like broadcast, multicast, and frames that are supposed to go to your particular computer. And by the way, in Wireshark, you don't see the .11 frames. You see the 802.3 frames or the Ethernet 2 frames because it's coming into your adapter and then it's being converted to Ethernet. All right. But with a specialized adapter, in MetaGeek, they use what we call AirPCAP NX, but that specialized adapter operates in promiscuous mode, and it actually captures the .11 traffic on the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz spectrum. It also supports captures from Wireshark, Omnipeak, and reports on the devices, and you're going to see all the frames, the control frames, the management frames, the data frames, and so on. Wireshark allows you to take that data and then analyze that data, drill down into that information. Interestingly enough, if you open up Wireshark and you start capturing frames on your wireless adapter, you're not going to see .11 frames. You're going to see Ethernet 2 frames. So you have to be running an adapter that's running in promiscuous mode to be able to capture the wireless traffic. All right. Wireshark, I'm sure you've seen and heard of and used at some point or another. Omnipeak Professional, kind of expensive, but from the perspective of doing analyses and troubleshooting, very, very good tool. There's appliance-based versions, and then there are software-based versions that you can install. It does require a specialized wireless USB adapter. So that captures packets, it lists the top protocols, the top talkers, it gives you a map that geographically represents the conversation between different nodes, and it is Windows-based, but a very, very powerful tool. You want to get into the really good area, then you go into the AirMagnet Wi-Fi Analyzer. This product actually also requires a specialized adapter. It can be done, applied as an appliance, or deployed as an appliance, but it's wonderful for troubleshooting and analyzing wireless networks. Remember, like I said, there's really only two things that I've seen as an engineer that I have to deal with on a regular basis. Either some issue with authentication and authorization, or some issue with the spectrum. That's assuming that the configurations, like I said, are done and they've been verified and tested correctly. Okay. Now, as far as Cisco tools go, we've got the CLI commands that we can use. The GUI. There's some troubleshooting tools built into the GUI. We have Cisco Active Advisor. That's our cloud-based lifecycle management tool for the management of different Cisco products. And then you have your wireless LAN controller config analyzer to evaluate the configuration for best practices and errors. I use this a lot, actually, especially if I'm asked to go into a new environment and I'm asked to identify or baseline the security for a particular environment. Okay, we'll take a look at these tools in this chapter or the rest of this lesson, and these are the tools that you'll definitely want to use. Okay, as far as the CLI goes, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular class to get into detail on all the different troubleshooting tools. There are some troubleshooting labs that you guys will have access to, but there's some different commands that you can use to troubleshoot clients. For example, you can do a show client detail. You can do a show client for a particular radio or particular AP. You can do a show client for all the radios for an AP, and so on. The show client detail will give you the client's username, the associated AP, SSID, IP address, data rates, mobility, security, etc. One of the commands that I like to use a lot for the client troubleshooting is a show client detail and the show client summary. Okay. Again, you can see all this stuff in the GUI, right? So, but there are some additional things that you can get from command line that you might not be able to find in the GUI, or you might not be able to see directly in the GUI. As far as system troubleshooting, show boot. Show boot is going to show you which software is primary or active. Show inventory gives you all the information about the platform, the serial number, the model, the maximum number of APs supported, etc. Show license all. That'll give you a status of your license, your AP count, and so on. Show running config. Actually, in the controller, it's show run dash config. Show run dash config. That's going to give you your configuration. Show run dash config commands gives you the output like you would see in iOS. If you do a show run dash config, it gives you everything, right? It gives you the APs, the radios, the wireless LANs, everything. If you do a show run dash config commands, that shows you outputs like you would see with an iOS show running config output. You can do show sysinfo, SYSINFO. That's going to show software levels, date and time, country-specific information, fan statistics, radios, MAC addresses. Show tech support. That gives you the configuration statistics that Cisco TAC might need to do some advanced troubleshooting. Show time. And you do have context-sensitive help. And there's obviously documentation on cisco.com to see all of the details of these commands. But those are just some of the basic ones. You can view logs by do show logging. You can see interface statistics by doing a show port summary or show interface summary. You can look at radio information by doing a show 802.11a or show 802.11b. You can look at wireless LAN settings by doing a show wireless LAN and then putting in the SSID. That'll give you the information about the status of the wireless LAN, the settings for that wireless LAN, the name, the security information. Show AP config is a way that you can see the AP configuration. Show AP config general, show AP join stats, show AP summary. There's a whole bunch of different troubleshooting commands. Mobility, you can troubleshoot by doing show mobility summary. Show mobility AP list will give you a list of all the mobility groups and the subdomains and so on. You can find most of this information in the GUI, but obviously the command line can be useful as well. The wireless LAN GUI, that's where you're going to see a lot of the monitoring capabilities. If you want to use prime infrastructure, you can, but if you're not using prime infrastructure, you can use the management tools built into the GUI for the wireless LAN controller. On the monitor summary screen, you'll see things like controller summary, most recent traps, access point summary, client summary. Let me show you guys that real quick. Under management, we have lots of different options. Here's the summary that I was referring to. So we're going to see, management protocols that are enabled and so on. Incidentally, this is one thing I want to point out real quick. Management via wireless. If this is not checked, which is not checked by default, you would not be able to manage the file system on this device over the wireless network. You'd have to be physically wired to the network to manage the device. So that's a feature that you might want to turn on. Okay. Monitor summary, you can obviously see, just the basics, controller summary. If there were trap messages sent, you can see that. Access point summary, the number of clients connected, and so on. You can go under APs, and you can see the list of APs, the uptime, who's associated to those APs, and so on. Under the actual management menu, that's where you're going to see message logging information, trap logging information, the tech support information, and we can configure all the aspects. If you have Clean Air enabled and you have Clean Air access points installed, you can look for interfering devices and so on. That's under the monitor screen here, and you can see active rogue APs, active rogue clients. Click in the detail, and I can see the information about these rogue APs and whatnot. And then I can click on that access point, and I can contain it. I can generate alerts and so on. I can even see who's actually associated to that rogue AP. And I see that through the spectrum, right? It's not that I'm getting access to those particular clients. I can just see the transactions that are occurring between the devices. On the Meraki side, you've got the Cisco Active Advisor. Actually, not just the Meraki side, but just in general, right? This allows us to generate reports. It is a cloud-based service, but it provides you lifecycle information about the network inventory. It's available standalone or with Cisco network management tools. But the idea here is that you're mitigating risk by getting up-to-date information about your products. Emails get automatically sent to you if there's an update or a requirement. And you can actually go to I'm going to put this in the chat window here. Cisco activeadvisor.com. And you log into that with your Cisco ID. All right. If you're logging in from your enterprise network, you can actually have your network scanned. You need to make sure that you have the appropriate credentials to authenticate to the devices themselves. And then what happens is Cisco then goes in and finds the devices, loads the information, and evaluates those devices. All right. So I've used this tool from time to time. If customers want us to do an assessment, we can go ahead and launch this tool. It gives us that first high-level view, right? The nice thing about this as well is it gives us product advisories. Is there end of life? Is the product end of life? Is it end of sale? And so on. So that'll identify whether or not you need to upgrade. It'll identify whether the device is under contract, if there are any warranty issues, all kinds of great things. It can be challenging to manage these devices. Then you can get alerts. The Cisco Active Advisor tool allows you to generate a health score of the network based on best practice configuration standards. And it can check your distribution layer, your access layer. You can do an analysis on the core switches, and then you can export all that information. Okay. There is another tool that you should definitely become familiar with. It's called the Wireless LAN Wireless LAN Controller Configuration Administrator. It was actually developed by Cisco engineers to evaluate the wireless LAN controller configuration and check the controller configuration against best practice standards. So you actually have to download and install the tool. It's called the WLCCA tool, and you get that from the Cisco support community. Just search for Cisco File Exchange, and you'll be able to get that information. You get the config from your controller using the show run config or going into the GUI and getting the configuration. You open up the file in WLCCA, and then it goes through and it checks the configuration of your controller. There are about 100 different things that it goes through and verifies based on cases that have been provided by Cisco, based on TAC escalations and so on, covers best practices, compares configurations between controllers, gives you detailed information, model numbers, RF summary, clean air persistent devices or interferers in the network. It provides information about radio frequency analysis, and so on. You can see some of the outputs here. Very, very useful tool. And if you're not using it in your environment today, I would definitely recommend kind of going out and taking a look at that. It's a very useful tool. So in this lesson, WLCC, by the way, just Google that and search for it online. We talked about third-party Wi-Fi scanners in this lesson, how we look at APs, signal strength, security, etc., mapping tools, the ability to show the RF coverage on the map, third-party packet analyzers, different types of tools in the CLI and the GUI. I mentioned a lot of command line commands. All right, I didn't give them to you specifically. I didn't type them out. You didn't see them on the slide deck. But I do suggest either you go back and pause the video and kind of go through each of those commands, or just look online on Cisco.com. Cisco always publishes command references for their products, so you can be able to identify those commands. Active Advisor we talked about, and then finally, which is a great tool, Cisco Active Advisor, and then the Cisco Wireless LAN Controller Config Analyzer. Okay. All right. Lots and lots of good stuff. We didn't get into specifics of troubleshooting, but at least it's a lot of good information. All right. So the last lesson that we have is describing troubleshooting methodology. What process do I take when I'm going through the troubleshooting process? But we're going to break now for lunch, and then we're going to do that last lesson, and then we'll just spend the rest of the day kind of working on labs, and I'll be on the WebEx to assist you guys if you need any assistance with the lab exercises. All right?